It was October 1982, and the air up on the Kootenai Plateau cut through the heavy denim and wool like a razor, smelling perpetually of pine sap, stale coffee, and frozen diesel. We were miles past the last paved road, cutting timber for Pacific Standard, living out of metal barracks that always smelled of mildew and cheap tobacco. My hands never truly warmed up, even gripping the vibrating handle of the Husqvarna for 12 hours straight. The whole operation ran on fumes, grit, and the unspoken agreement that we wouldn't think too much about being this isolated. We were just cogs in the system, pulling paychecks for tearing down the world. Frankie the Ox Marston usually drove the skidder, a massive engine of destruction he handled with surprising grace. He was built like a stone wall, had a permanent filterless cigarette dangling from his lower lip, and used to whistle old Johnny Cash songs loud enough to cut through the roar of the machinery. Lately, though, Frankie had quit whistling. He'd just grunt, squinting into the fog that clung to the upper ridges. Then there was young Danny, the new guy, only 19, who spent every break trying to tune his transistor radio, hoping to catch a distant hockey game. But all he ever got was static and the high-pitched metallic whine of the power lines running deep into the valley. He was always looking over his shoulder. We worked hard, lived hard, and mostly ignored the local chatter about the high country being off-limits to machines. But up here, you eventually learned to fear the silence. When the chainsaws stopped, the woods didn't just fall quiet, they inhaled. It was a deep, heavy, suffocating silence that made the small hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Frankie tried to blame it on the bears, saying the grizzlies were getting bolder, but the way he'd scanned the tree line when he said it sounded more like an appeal than an observation. Yesterday we'd cleared a particularly dense section near the old creek bed, an area the maps claimed was untouched, virgin growth. We knocked off at dusk, covered in wet sawdust and fatigue, eager for the lukewarm beer back at camp. This morning, after the fog finally lifted around 11 a.m., Frankie fired up the cat, intending to haul the last of the bucked spruce. That's when we saw it. Not a logging road, not a deer trail, but a distinct line of disturbance that had simply not been there 12 hours before. It ran straight through a patch of thick underbrush that should have taken us a whole afternoon to clear with a brush cutter. The path was too narrow for any of our vehicles, yet the brush was pressed down flat, almost combed back, and the earth looked churned up deep, like a massive, heavy plow had passed through the mud. Frankie stopped the cat, the engine sputtering into an uneasy silence, and he killed it. He pointed at the base of a huge, ancient Douglas fir, a trunk easily 6 feet across. About 5 feet up the trunk, the thick, gray-brown bark had been peeled clean away in long, violent strips, leaving the white, wounded wood exposed. And embedded high in that scarred wood, sticking out like splintered bone, was a knot of thick, matted brown hair. It was too coarse and too long to belong to any deer or bear I'd ever seen. The smell hit me then. It wasn't pine or diesel or wet earth. It was musky, wet, and profoundly foul, like old meat left in a dark, cold place. We hadn't seen a bear in days. This felt different. This felt like a threat. The smell stuck to the back of my throat, metallic and dense, making my sinuses burn. I wiped my gloved hand instinctively on my damp overalls, trying to shake off the profound wrongness of it all. Johnson, usually the loudest man in the entire county, didn't say a damn thing, just kept staring up at the patch of hair, his jaw tight. It wasn't just the hair or the sheer force required to peel bark that high. It was the atmosphere. We were maybe half a mile from the Skidder Trail, still in earshot of civilization's faint, distant machinery, but the forest suddenly went dead quiet. Not even the high, thin whine of the mosquitoes was audible anymore. The light was fading fast, but the temperature drop felt instantaneous, like someone had opened a massive freezer door directly into the clearing. I could see my own breath puffing out, thick and white, even though it was only early October and we'd been sweating minutes earlier. The usual forest background noise, the distant caw of a raven, the scatter of mice, the wind through the high pines, was just gone. It was replaced by a heavy, cotton-thick vacuum, a soundlessness that pressed in on the eardrums. We started hiking back toward the staging area, our silence amplifying the sudden, unnatural void. We hadn't taken 20 steps when we heard it. It came from deep in the dense timberline to our west, too far away to pinpoint exactly, but close enough to feel. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the crack of a branch under snow load or a falling tree. It was too solid, too rhythmic. It sounded like a massive, dense fist hitting the base of an old-growth cedar. It vibrated more than sounded, a dull, resonant shockwave moving through the damp earth and into the soles of my boots. Johnson spun around, his Pulaski axe half-raised, adrenaline tightening the skin around his eyes. Just a backfire, maybe, he muttered, sounding unconvinced, trying to inject some of his usual bravado into the dead air. Or maybe Old Man Pete is messing with his cat again. But Pete was 10 miles away, and the sound was organic, wet, and heavy. It wasn't metal striking metal. We ignored his attempted rationalization and walked faster, ignoring the tightening knot in my gut, choosing to believe the sound was benign, mechanical, distant. Then the sound came again, closer this time, and it wasn't a knock. It was a noise that defied rational description, a deep, guttural moan, low enough to feel in the chest cavity, but stretched thin, like fabric tearing underwater. It held a raw, grieving quality, but overlaid with something vast, predatory, and profoundly angry. It lasted only a few seconds, ending in a sort of wet, heavy exhalation that carried across the deepening gloom. It wasn't human. It wasn't bear. It was a sound of immense, desperate isolation and crushing physical power. We broke into a panicked jog, crashing blindly through the low brush, desperate for the sight of the camp lights. We knew, without having to speak it, that whatever had stripped that tree was now actively tracking our retreat, and the smell of cold musk was suddenly strong again, heavy on the air behind us, closer than it had any right to be. We broke into a panicked jog, crashing blindly through the low brush, desperate for the sight of the camp lights. We knew, without having to speak it, that whatever had stripped that tree was now actively tracking our retreat, and the smell of cold musk was suddenly strong again, heavy on the air behind us, closer than it had any right to be. We hit the perimeter gasping, stumbling over the frozen mud flats near the generator. The humming sound of the diesel engine, usually an annoyance, felt like a lifeline. But the relief evaporated quickly. We didn't discuss what we had heard or smelled. We simply went through the motions, checking the fuel tanks, securing the door bolts, with a frenzied urgency that masked sheer terror. The real breakdown started the second night. The howls were still there, echoing off the high ridges, but they were different now. Less territorial, more investigative. I was trying to force myself into sleep, tucked into my narrow bunk, the coarse wool blanket scratching irritatingly against my chin, when the investigative sounds began. A heavy, resonant thud, like a sack of wet cement dropping onto frozen earth, impacted just beyond the western edge of the clearing. Then absolute silence. Not quiet, but a sudden vacuum of sound, a heavy pressure that made my ears ache. Then came the scratching. It wasn't a frantic tearing. It sounded like thick, ragged fingernails being dragged slowly, deliberately down the rough-hewn logs of the bunkhouse wall. Scratch. Stop. Scratch. Stop. It was dry, abrasive, utterly precise, moving horizontally right at the level of the narrow, plastic-sheeted window, just 6 feet from my head. It explored every knot and groove in the wood before descending slowly, only to rise again. It lasted maybe 20 minutes, but time had ceased to exist. Every one of us was awake, staring at the ceiling, pretending the sounds weren't happening. Sleep became a joke. We ran on stale coffee and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Tempers flared instantly. Jimmy nearly came to blows with Old Man Fitz over a misplaced tin opener. It wasn't the opener. It was the awareness that something immense was circling us every night, reducing our world to a tiny, brightly lit cage. Fitz was the first to genuinely fracture. He stopped eating anything hot, surviving only on hardtack biscuits and cold water. He'd spend hours sitting by the dying fire pit, meticulously cleaning his ancient, lever-action rifle, polishing the brass parts until they gleamed unnaturally under the floodlights. He stopped talking about logging and started talking about the old stories, the things the indigenous elders whispered about the deep woods, entities that weren't animal and weren't spirit, but something older, something that hated the smell of our iron and our smoke. He grew obsessed with the musk. He insisted he could taste it in the coffee, claiming it was trying to scent mark our provisions, to taint our last connection. Bunkhouse door, creating a barricade that looked more like a tomb than a defense. We didn't try to stop him. We were all terrified, but Fitz was already somewhere else, lost to the absolute, suffocating proximity of the thing lurking just outside the fragile ring of light. The silence after the clanging of the spools was not a natural quiet. It was the sound of air being vacuumed out of a room. We lay there, breathing shallowly, listening to the generator thrumming a meaningless rhythm that did nothing to cover the wet, heavy rasping sound now coming from just outside the thin plywood wall. It smelled awful. It wasn't just the pine and the residual diesel. This was a smell that dug into the back of your throat, thick with wet hair, musk, and something sour and distinctly predatory, like a bear's den soaked in stale blood. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, on the slight tremor running through the heavy cable spools Fitz had used to jam it shut. We waited an hour, maybe two, suspended in that awful, frozen moment where your mind insists the world is normal while every nerve ending screams danger. Then, the silence broke. It wasn't the guttural sound from before. It was a pressure, a dull, seismic thud that didn't just hit the door, it rattled the entire structure down to its frozen foundations. The thin, yellow bulb hanging over the table swung violently. Dust rained down from the ceiling joints. Fitz, who hadn't moved since finishing his terrifying barricade, let out a choked sound, a high, thin whine that didn't sound human. We didn't need to look at each other to know what that impact meant. This thing was no longer sniffing around. It was testing the integrity of our pitiful shelter. Another thud, harder this time. The steel spools skidded a few inches on the floorboards, scraping lines into the wood. Then came the sound that shattered whatever sanity we had left, the sound of wood fibers tearing slowly apart, like wet canvas splitting under impossible strain. Near the upper latch, where the door frame met the panel, a vertical fissure appeared. It wasn't a crack, it was a wound, widening with agonizing slowness. And then we saw it. It wasn't a shadow. It was density. A mass of hair, black as oil and matted with dirt, filled the splintering gap. The sheer scale of it was paralyzing. It was close enough that the foul, rank heat of its body poured through the opening, mixing with the frigid mountain air. But the worst part, the reason I still wake up choking 30 years later, was the claw. It was immense, curving like a scythe, tipped with an ivory nail the size of a Zippo lighter. It wasn't moving fast, but with terrible, methodical purpose. It inserted the claw tip into the deepening fissure and began to pull back, using the mechanical advantage of the steel barricade against itself. The steel groaned, a high-pitched, desperate sound that went completely ignored by the thing applying the pressure. We watched, paralyzed, as the steel wheels slowly, undeniably, began to shift. The creature wasn't attacking us in a frenzy. It was simply dismantling our defenses, brick by agonizing brick, demonstrating a strength that defied physics and proved that our weapons, our rifles, our chainsaws, were useless playthings. The realization hit me like an electric shock. We weren't trespassers in a wild place. We were insects being meticulously peeled out of a log. And the eye, when it rolled into view through the gap, reflecting the weak yellow light, was dark, deep-set, and filled with a terrifyingly casual intelligence. It knew we were trapped. It was just deciding how to open the tin. I didn't wait for the decision to be finalized. The sight of that eye, deep-set and intelligent, calculating the quickest way to tear us apart, fractured the last bit of reality I was holding on to. Rick lunged, not for the front door where the thing was, but for the rear window that overlooked the 100-foot drop into the ravine. Better to take the risk of snapping an ankle than being gently peeled. We went through the opening like frightened birds, glass showering the frozen ground. Doug, being the biggest, got hung up. He was halfway out, legs kicking in frantic desperation against the interior wall when the first sound came. It wasn't a roar or a snap of a tree, but a colossal thump against the exterior cedar wall, a noise that vibrated through the foundation and into my teeth. It was followed by a sound I'll carry to my grave, a high-pitched, wet grating, like a serrated saw blade tearing through tough, wet hide, which is exactly what it was doing to the window frame Doug was lodged in. Doug stopped struggling. He didn't cry out. He just went still. I threw myself flat, adrenaline flooding my veins with battery acid, and saw the massive shadow fall over Doug's back. Then the pressure gave way. Doug was gone, sucked backward through the hole in the wall with a sickening, liquid pop as the frame finally gave. Rick, who had managed to clear the window beside me, didn't look back. Neither did I. The smell was chasing us, a thick, overpowering stink of methane and wet dog and something burnt, like ozone after a high-voltage surge. We scrambled over the icy ground toward the F-350 diesel, our salvation parked 30 yards away. I ripped the door open and slid across the bench seat, fumbling the keys into the ignition. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped the whole heavy chain once. Start it. Start it, you bastard. Rick was screaming, his voice ragged. He was staring out the back window of the cab, his face illuminated briefly by the weak moonlight. I turned the key. Crank, crank, crank. The cold diesel engine protested, chugging once before dying immediately. I pumped the pedal furiously. The smell was suddenly overwhelming, closer than it should be. It was outside the truck, right next to Rick's door. It's here. It's right here. Rick clawed at the dash, his eyes wide and vacant. I jammed the key again. Crank. Chug, chug, chug. The engine caught, spitting thick, white exhaust into the frozen air. Just as I slammed the truck into reverse, there was a sound like a basketball hitting wet leather, and the side mirror exploded inward, glass spraying across Rick's shoulder. Through the passenger window, framed for a millisecond in the light of the reversing lamps, was the hand. 5 fingers, massive, thick black hair matted with grime and something darker. It had the power to crush a skull, yet it seemed to be searching, feeling its way across the steel paneling with terrifying precision. I mashed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck screamed backward, tires throwing gravel and frozen mud high into the air. We heard a terrible screech, the sound of 800 pounds of muscle protesting against the truck's sudden movement. And then we broke free, plunging onto the rough logging road. I didn't slow down until the engine was redlining and the stench of burning pine was replacing the musk of the creature. We left the lights on the bunkhouse burning, casting a weak, impotent yellow glow on the surrounding blackness, knowing exactly what was waiting there. Doug was gone, and we were truly alone now, racing toward dawn and civilization, praying the thing couldn't match the speed of a '78 Ford. We drove until the sun cracked the horizon, turning the oppressive black of the ancient forest into a damp, sickly gray. My hands were locked on the wheel, slick with sweat, and the faint smell of pine pitch mixed with something acrid. Fear, maybe. Johnny, beside me, hadn't spoken since we hit the main highway, just sat there grinding his teeth, a low, mechanical rasp that was worse than screaming. When we finally hit Port Alberni and the first gas station lights, the sheer, crushing reality of what we'd done, leaving Doug, crashed down. We looked like escaped convicts, reeking of stale sweat and wood smoke, our eyes wide, scanning the rooftops for movement. The police were worse than useless. We tried to tell them about the camp, about Doug's screaming stopping suddenly, about the eyes and the stench that tasted like burnt ozone and grave dirt. They took our statements, pages of detailed, frantic descriptions of height, fur, speed, and the sheer, focused malice of it, and filed them neatly under accidental fatality / missing person, likely fell into a ravine or encountered wildlife. They kept asking us why we didn't use the radio, why we fled instead of fighting. How could I explain that fighting that thing was like trying to punch a hole in the night itself? No one was going back up that road, not even for Doug's body. The official conclusion was that we suffered a collective hysteria brought on by exhaustion and the isolation of the bush. They handed us back our IDs and a pamphlet for local counseling services. Johnny lasted 3 weeks. He started seeing movement in the periphery of his vision, even in bright sunlight. He couldn't stand the quiet. He tried to tell his wife it wasn't a bear, that the thing was intelligent, that it understood cause and effect, but she just held him tighter and asked him to take his sleeping pills. He ended it in his garage, the note saying something cryptic about the stillness listening. Me? I stopped working the woods entirely. The sound of a chainsaw now makes my stomach clench. I'm a night watchman now, staring at concrete walls and fluorescent lights in an empty warehouse in Nanaimo. It's boring, sterile, and predictable, but the predictability is a lie. The cold still gets into my bones in the way it did that night, a deep, pervasive chill that has nothing to do with the thermostat. I see the official reports sometimes, the closing statements, the neat, bureaucratic dismissal of what happened in WS where the lights end. It knows how thin the veneer of our civilization is. It tasted fear that night, and it learned our limits. It's waiting for the next crew, the next season, the next moment we forget the true, ancient shape of the wild. It is still out there, hungry, patient, and now it knows our